Morning, ladies and gentlemen. Very nice to be here. I am not part of the Faculty of Science. I'm actually part of the Faculty of Engineering, but I'm actually a microbiologist by background. In that role, I'm also not just an academic, but currently the Associate Dean International. And I thought I'd mention that not just as a fact in itself, but because of the topic for today. Now, we sit here in Australia very, very comfortably, typically, because we have, by world standards, relatively low rates of disease generally. And we feel pretty safe here because many of the diseases that afflict people in a whole range of countries, and particularly with regard to viruses, we don't have here in Australia. And that's not just the sort of exotic, unusual viruses that we'll consider today in relation to deepest, darkest Africa, for example, but even viruses like rabies, where in Western Europe and the US, where we think of those countries being like ourselves and very well developed and generally safe, they actually have a range of agents that can cause very severe disease. And because of the role I have and the chance to travel, that suddenly, for me, viruses are much more real at a personal level. So in this role as Associate Dean International, I have responsibility for travelling the world, meeting with various organisations to develop partnerships and looking at recruiting international students to UNSW. So in 2015, for example, I made a trip to Africa and I started in Ethiopia. And suddenly it was, well, if you're going to go to countries like Ethiopia and others, you need to have a vaccination for yellow fever. And I hadn't really thought about that before. It's not a vaccination that a lot of people get unless you're going to regions in the world where that kind of disease is endemic. So I go and get the vaccination, and I've got my little card as I'll show you shortly. In Ethiopia, it's a country that's quite some elevation, and it's only the low-lying parts that you have concern about yellow fever, because yellow fever is a disease that is mosquito-borne. It's spread by mosquitoes as a vector. And so I was thinking, well, hang on, I'm going to be in Addis Ababa, which is the capital, and at elevation, I won't have to worry. But I was in my hotel room the first night and I start to hear a buzz. And I realised there's a mosquito buzzing around. Now here, of course, generally we think mosquitoes are just nuisance value, right? We get bitten and we get a spot and we get itchy and it's just a pain. But suddenly it was like, I wonder if that mosquito is carrying some sort of virus that could kill me. And I was thinking, well, hang on, I've had the yellow fever vaccination, so I should be okay. But then you start to think about a whole range of viruses that can be carried by mosquitoes in these more exotic parts of the world and what that particular mosquito might have been carrying. And if it bit me during the night, was I going to wake up the next day and over the next few days start to feel bad and worse and eventually maybe die? So I had the chance to travel through a range of African countries, and of course this is then a recurring theme. And in part, as I move from Eastern Africa to Western Africa, of course I'm getting very close, or much closer, to the hot zone where we're worrying about really serious viruses like Ebola. And of course we've seen massive problems with Ebola in the last couple of years. So just for reference, if you're thinking about travelling, if you haven't had that opportunity, you're thinking about going to parts of the world like South America or sub-Saharan Africa, suddenly viruses like yellow fever and others become a very real consideration and threat. And so you do end up having to get vaccinated for yellow fever, and currently yellow fever vaccination is the only international vaccination that is required for entry to certain countries, and indeed for re-entry to Australia. So when you go to the doctor and get this vaccination, you get this little card, you have to show that when you're entering into countries like Uganda or Nigeria. but also when you return to Australia, you have to pull that out. And in theory, if you don't have that and you've been to those countries, they can take you away and set you in isolation for a few weeks to make sure that you haven't brought something exotic back with you. All of you, I suspect, well, that's the yellow fever virus, by the way, and we might talk a bit about that later. The other thing is that I'm actually not Australian. I'm actually English by birth, and I'm of an age where smallpox, as a major viral scourge globally, was still very, very active. I suspect that many of you are of an age where you have not had a smallpox vaccination. Okay, somewhere on my arm I can still sort of identify where I got this little scratch on the arm with an attenuated virus that protected me against smallpox. And when we think about, and you'll see this as we look at the movie and think about the consequences of severe viral infection, you realise that vaccination is such an important means of control of many viruses. And one of the best examples, of course, is smallpox. This is what happens if you're unvaccinated and smallpox was around. Okay? These pustules all over the body, ultimately leading to also internal disruption and ultimately organ failure, death. A very, very nasty disease, and one where today now, because of extensive vaccination campaigns, we've eradicated this virus from the wild, from the human herd. And so we don't have to worry about it anymore. Well, except for the two stocks that still sit in two parts of the world. We can maybe talk about that a little later as well. So I just thought I'd set the scene a little bit personally about sort of my involvement, in a sense, with viruses and my own concerns. And then late last year, actually around this very time, just before teaching the course in 2015, I went to Chile. And I happened to be in my hotel room in Santiago, and I was looking for something to watch in English. And believe it or not, what comes on the TV but Outbreak? I kid you not. That is a screenshot from the TV in my hotel room in Santiago last year. As I sat and watched this movie, I thought, I can't get away from this. I've been teaching in this course for over a decade, and I still really, really enjoy watching the movie, but I just could not believe that here I am, halfway around the world from home here in Sydney, and what comes on the TV but this movie? I felt like it's chasing me. So, I'm also, right now, I'm spending time in Uganda as part of UNSW's Institute for Global Development that was implemented by our new Vice-Chancellor, and we're working very closely with a university in the north of Uganda called Gulu. And even there we start to think about very serious diseases. In this case, not so much viral diseases, although they're still of concern, but for instance, you go there and you're popping pills on a daily basis to try and prevent malaria. Okay, so while today is really about viruses, realise that in these more interesting and exotic parts of the world, there are a whole range of things that might kill you. And there have been very recently in northern Uganda a couple of thousand deaths. Extensive illness, but a couple of thousand deaths from malaria, which is a parasite. So, to today. What I'm here for is to work with you, and hopefully we'll have a very good discussion around Outbreak as the movie that sets the scene, and around viruses in general. As I said, we've been doing this in this course now since its inception, so it's over a decade. And even though this movie, obviously, as each year goes by, is getting older and older, I think it's still quite current. And for me, it's one of the movies that we use that shows the science throughout. Really, there are scientific aspects from start to finish. And as we'll see and hopefully bring out in discussion, some of the science is very real and very good. and other parts of it, of course, Hollywood has left its touch on the science. In terms of logistics, if you're needing to contact me, I live in the Dean's unit, which is in the computer science building down near, well, Coffee on Campus is probably the landmark I always think of, because that's where I spend a lot of time, drinking coffee and talking to people. That's when I'm here on campus. Because of my role, I'm away about half the time. I'm actually officially on leave from the university from tomorrow, but I hope to be able to sort of stay in touch with you via the web or via electronic means. So I've listed my phone number, but again, I'm hardly ever at my desk, so hence good luck. Email is probably still the best way to contact me. I believe there's the Moodle site, and I can ask Scott if I'm set up for that, so we can stay in touch that way, and particularly with the students taking this as a purely online version. But I'm also a bit of a social media fiend, so I've listed my Twitter name, and also suggest that if you have something to raise about the course, just use the SCIF 1004 hashtag, and I'll make sure that I'm set up to track that hashtag. So that's just a few ways that we can try and stay in touch if you want to follow up anything past today's session. Speaking of which, so what I'd like you to do as we are watching the movie is to consider really these three things. Is what big picture issues do you see coming through as you watch the movie? There are a number of, there's a central plot, and there are a number of sort of subplots or themes that run through the movie. So try and view the movie at a range of levels, okay? Think about what's going on and the messages and themes that are coming through. There's also some interesting imagery that we talk about, and particularly given this is a general education course, we're trying to marry together the more artistic and aesthetic, political, economic issues with the science itself. And then of course we've got the technical issues that will definitely come through in the movie, and we can consider how much is fact and how much is fiction and how much is somewhere in between. So really those are the three scene setters to focus upon as you're watching the movie. I know you have a quiz which is online. The quiz is really quite different to how it's been in previous years, where we had more open-ended questions, and I might use some of those to open the discussion after the movie. So the plan is, I've set the scene a bit now, we're going to watch the movie. After that, I do have a slide deck with a lot of technical sort of information and graphics and things like that. That will be available in Moodle. But what I hope to do, and what we've normally done each year that I've been involved, is we start with Q&A, and it seems that after the first question it rolls on and we can have a really nice discussion about outbreak itself and viruses without necessarily going to the slides. So we'll use those as a bit of backup if we need them. Okay? So that's the running plan. Let me see if I can get the technology switched over so that we can actually start watching the movie. Yeah, it's, as I said, the movie, well, I guess it doesn't really date itself terribly. You know, it's hard to sort of really pick exactly when it's set. And from the point of view of a movie that highlights a range of issues around viruses, it's actually really quite good. And again, the science in the broad sense runs all the way through. So I brought back up these three sort of main points that I raised with you before the movie started. So what did you see as some of the big issues that come out of Outbreak? Right, so obviously the idea of the weapon and viruses, well, microorganisms in general can be considered to be a pretty interesting weapon. And if you think about where we are today, we really haven't changed very much in terms of other kinds of armaments for warfare, but there has been over time a lot of work on biological weapons, although currently I guess the world policy, at least from the major powers, is that we need to stop. And that's really where it is. And in fact, just mentioning one aspect of that, you see towards the beginning of the movie where they're talking about Fort Detrick, USAMRIID, so the establishment where they were doing a lot of the development of biological weapons or research into biological agents in general, in Maryland. Okay, now that no longer exists. The US Army, in fact, closed that, decommissioned that facility and demolished it. So Fort Detrick as an entity has been gone now for several years. But certainly that's one of the major themes or plot lines that runs through the movie, is the desire to take science and do something bad with it. And as a scientist, that's something that concerns us all. It's nice to think we can do some wonderful research and that sits in isolation and we can investigate a virus. You heard Daniel's talking about, we want to take the virus and map it down to its last gene and understand it. It'll make you famous. I've discovered this new virus. Okay, that's the sort of fundamental science that people like to do, and that's really appropriate in this area. People discovering new viruses and wanting to understand them down to that last gene that they talked about is something that a lot of scientists in that area would like to do. But of course, then it's where do we go from there? So understanding them and creating the vaccine, doing the good thing by humanity is to say, well, if we know this virus is around and it can do us major harm, how can we prevent it? How can we manage it? How can we treat it? And that comes through in the movie as well.
So in the movie there's a cure and of course they can figure it out in 30 minutes.
Of course.
Or time in 2 minutes of film time. But like with Ebola and smallpox and whatever, we don't have cures, do we? We just got to contain the spread.
No, well, so good question. So if we look at what's happened there, it's part of the embellishment of Hollywood. The idea that we can suddenly grab the monkey, we can take something out of that monkey and synthesize, I think they said, litres of antibodies in 2 minutes of film time in an afternoon, right? Just like that. Hollywood romanticism at its best. Taking the idea of the science, the idea of using antibodies to treat a virus, if we just take that concept, a really good example is rabies. Right? There is currently no recognised vaccine for rabies. There is what we call a candidate vaccine. Fairly recently, people have developed what we think could be a vaccine for rabies. But right now, with rabies, it's prevention. Don't get bitten by a rabid dog or a rabid possum or any of the range of animals that actually carry the virus. Well, let me come back to that. But with rabies, the only treatment we have is actually to give people exactly what they did in the movie there, to give them what we call convalescent sera. What does that mean? It means that people who've actually recovered from the illness have antibodies in their bloodstream. And we can take the serum, exactly like they did in the movie, and provide that serum to someone who's recently been bitten by a rabid animal. Okay? That works well in the early stages, not of disease, but of infection. What does that mean? If I've been bitten by a rabid dog, while the virus is still early in its circulation in my body in the bloodstream, I can receive some convalescent serum from the blood. Right, we all know, right, when people take blood, you've basically got blood cells, and then the non-cell part is what we call serum, and that's what you see in those little bags in the movie. Now, if we put that serum into the bloodstream after someone's been bitten recently by, say, a rabid dog, the antibodies will circulate and they'll find and neutralise the virus. The problem comes, and this is again part of the sort of the embellishment of Hollywood, is that once that virus has got to its target site, in the case of rabies, that's the nervous system, and in particular the central nervous system and the brain. Once the virus is there, the antibodies will not be effective because they can't cross the blood-brain barrier effectively. And so once you've actually established a full-blown rabies infection, the idea of treating with a serum like that is kind of, again, Hollywood fiction. And this is kind of a bit of the joke in the movie here as well. Once someone's got that Motaba virus and that started to invade organs and you're hemorrhaging, the idea that suddenly you get a dose of the orange juice and you're going to be better in, a matter of minutes or maybe hours, it's fiction. Okay. They need obviously a nice, neat solution, not only in terms of finishing the story with regard to the virus and recovery, but of course, what else? What else happened? What else is a plot line in the movie? What happens with Dustin and Renee Russo? Yeah, right? The guy gets the girl. We had to have the romantic plot line as well as the virus. Yeah? Husband and wife break up. Husband and wife face adversity. Husband and wife come back together and ride off into the sunset together after she nearly dies of infection with the virus. Sweet. Right? So we needed her to recover. She should have died. Actually, I would have rather seen Casey survive. He was a more interesting character to me, so I would have rather seen him survive. No? Disagree?
Oh, sorry. For film language, the
Yep.
journey there was about arrogance and humility. And so Casey was arrogant the whole way through and would never admit his feelings. He was doomed from the start. Cuba got him junior. He was always going to live because he admitted he was afraid in the first act. And only when Dustin Hoffman admitted to the little girl that he still loved his wife, that's when everything was going to be okay.
Oh, I love it. No, I mean, that's what I've always loved about, in over 10 years of this course, I've never heard that. And I mean, the beauty of this course is that it really is a general education course and we get people from all walks of student life. But that's fascinating because I've just never heard anyone give that perspective on it, so thank you. Okay, so let's set the romantic bit aside and back to the technical stuff. So you had another question as well? No? Okay. So we talked about the antibodies. Oh, you asked about vaccines.
Oh, yeah. So, aren't vaccines primarily preventative? Like, we get smallpox vaccinations.
Absolutely. Because what we're relying on to combat an infection, whether it's viral or bacterial or whatever, is our immune system. And at times, our immune system simply cannot respond fast enough to an infection, and particularly an infection with a serious pathogen like a lethal virus, to be able to win that battle. You are going to lose. And so the way that we have to manage those pathogens or disease-causing organisms is through management, so prevention of contact for a start, or if there is a risk of contact, then having something like vaccination available. And in terms of vaccinations, really, I guess you'd say we have three types of vaccines that we use in human medicine. Well, in human and veterinary medicine, actually. So part of my background, I actually work very closely with the range of industries, but the poultry industry, and we've actually done work on vaccines to try and prevent salmonella colonising chicken. That's another story. But in terms of the types of vaccines, usually they're of three forms. One is what we call a killed or inactivated vaccine. What that means is we take the bug, say like the virus, and we kill it in some way so it can be no longer infective, okay? And we inject that as an inert substance in effect, okay, it's no longer alive, into the body. And the body reacts to something on that virus and we establish immunity. Okay, and we'll come back to immunity. The second is where we actually use what are called live attenuated vaccines. And really vaccination, and some of you may remember, heard the history, that the idea of vaccination in the modern sense, and I've got to say in the modern sense, because certainly there's a historical record going back to ancient times in China in particular that suggests there was vaccination actually practiced back then. But really vaccination as we see it in history started with a guy called Edward Jenner, who realised that milkmaids did not get smallpox. And they had a lot of contact with cows and would often contract what was called cowpox. So we'd get a disease that resembled smallpox from the cows, but it was a mild disease. You'd get this, you'd get a few of those sort of pustules like you saw earlier, but that was it. You'd feel a little bit sick and you would recover. But then you would never get smallpox. So he said, well, what happens if we take some scrapings out of some of these pustules of someone who's got cowpox and we actually vaccinate someone with that, and then we expose them to smallpox? Long story short, that worked, and that was the start of modern vaccination. Now that's a good example where they used a related what we call low virulence organism. It's a pathogen that causes disease, but a mild form of disease, and it's related enough to smallpox to give protection. And often protection is not necessarily direct, but can be cross protection in terms of immunity. I'll come back to that. Often what we do now is we find a version of the organism, and through holding it in the lab in some way or treating it in some way, it becomes what we call less virulent. It causes a much milder form of disease, but it's still alive. So we put it in the body and it starts to grow, starts to multiply. And the advantage of that is because the immune system is exposed to a much greater amount of the virus or the bacterium, we get a much better immune response. So live attenuated vaccines are really, really effective, but of course there's always that danger that if they revert, next thing you know, you've actually got the real disease. And then the third type of vaccine, which is much more modern, is with the tools we have available in biology today, we pull apart the organism, whether it's a virus or a bacterium, and we look for a particular part of the organism. So it might be something like the spikes that they talked about on the surface of the Ebola virus. And we take just that little piece and we make a vaccine from that. And so we inject that into the body. And the body recognises that and produces an immune response. And that's what protects us. We don't need the whole organism. So again, killed or inactivated, live attenuated, or what we call subunit vaccines. Okay, they're the three types of vaccines that any of us will have received in our life. Typically, someone older like myself, it's probably been the first two. And nowadays, particularly kids now, would be receiving some of what we call the subunit vaccines. They're considered safer and more efficient. Okay. Now, on the other side of that, how does our body react to attack by something like a virus or even to vaccination? The immune system has two parts. One part is what we call the humoral immune response. What that means is that certain cells in our body recognise that vaccine or that disease-causing agent, and those cells then start to produce antibodies that circulate in our bloodstream. Okay, these are proteins that circulate and then can attach and really deliver the invading agent to the rest of the immune system, but also can neutralise that agent in itself. And then we also have on the other side what's called cell-mediated immunity. So there are actually cells in our bloodstream that will circulate, find bodies, physical bodies like these viral particles in the bloodstream circulating, grab hold of them, envelop them, swallow them, and literally chew them up. Okay, so really what we rely on, and the immune response varies depending on the type of invading agent, but the immune response to fight off an infection is typically a combination of those two. And again, I just try to keep it very simple and less technical in terms of the actual language, but essentially what we aim to do is give you some understanding of how all of this works. So what they were doing there, indeed, was trying to exploit the immune system out of the monkey in particular, the host, and say we can find antibodies in there, we can reproduce those, and we can actually make antibodies. There is no problem with that as a principle. Making litres of antibodies on a lazy Sunday afternoon, that's the Hollywood embellishment. Question? Actually, that's a really, really good question, because the concern is, it's a great question, because I was thinking about that earlier. I don't know whether we'd raised that before in the course. But antibodies from a different species are actually recognised as foreign when they enter the body. So the idea that they took the monkey antibodies and used those, I think they used the words roadmap. They kind of used those to understand the parts of the antibody that are important in recognising the virus and being able to then construct antibodies. And we do have the science of what we call antibody engineering, that's reasonable. But again, that's not something that happens in hours. I mean, doing something like that would probably take months to at least get to the point in the science where we've got a prototype process that would then need to scale up to make lots of antibodies. But yeah, if you or I were injected with antibodies from a monkey or a goat or a chicken, we would directly into our bloodstream, we would recognise those as foreign, and our own body would attack those. Our human antibodies would attack the other antibodies as foreign. And that's the trick. As I said, convalescent sera, like the rabies story, because we're talking about antibodies that have come from a human who's been exposed to rabies and has survived, then we're talking about human antibodies going into another human body. That's okay, broadly speaking. But yeah, so you're perceptive. It's a problem to think about taking antibodies from particularly a distantly related or unrelated species, because they will be recognised as foreign. Yeah. So big issues. We've talked about the biological weapon and warfare. Others? Yes. Okay. No, that's all right.
In the movie, it's talking about the Ebola, whatever it was, virus that, type 1 and type 2 and stuff. And you hear about, like, superbugs, and there's a difference between Spanish flu and English flu, Australian flu and stuff.
Yep.
So I'm wondering with bigger diseases like malaria, for example, is the research that's done up in Papua New Guinea just for our local variety of malaria? Is it the same kind of malaria that happens in South America?
Let me come back to the viruses. We'll keep it in because there's a few good examples that highlight some of the issues that you're raising. If we start, well, let me go back. I will actually quickly go down to the slides and let me jump ahead to the virus in the movie. Okay, now, again, what Hollywood have done is taken a virus and a really good story about a virus and made, I think, quite a good storyline about it. So they talk about the Mataba virus and this Mataba Valley in Zaire. Right? I think what makes a good movie, and particularly if you sort of understand the stories behind it, is taking a lot of truth and a range of threads of truth and bring them together and then sort of making something plausible. Now, again, what they've done in this movie is they've elevated the story in a lot of ways. So we've got this virus called Mataba. And as they said, this invades cells and is replicating, so multiplying within cells, which is what viruses do, within hours, and in a matter of hours, lots of cells are dead and millions of viruses pour forth. And of course, this causes amazing destruction within the body. When they do the autopsy, right, on Jimbo, they talk about like a bomb went off within the abdomen, right? All the organs are kind of exploded, okay? Again, it's that Hollywood embellishment. So if we look at what the virus actually is, that's a wonderful little plush toy. Mataba is actually Ebola. So in fact, when they put the virus under the electron microscope at one point and he's zooming in and he's getting closer and closer and they show the viral particles, those images are just images of Ebola virus. So what Hollywood have done is said, let's take Ebola and put Ebola on steroids. Right? So we've got a virus that is called a hemorrhagic fever virus. Ebola can cause up to about 80, maybe in the worst cases, 90% mortality, right? But of course, what does Mataba cause? 100%. Everyone who gets it dies, right? Hollywood again. Ebola will kill people within several days. You do get a hemorrhagic fever. So as they started to go through the story of the virus, okay, those mild sort of flu-like symptoms, growing fever, then you start sort of bleeding. That is what happens. You do indeed get hemorrhage, but in a much finer internal way. You may start to get some bleeding from the eyes and nose because the virus is attacking typically at soft tissue boundaries, what we call mucous membranes, or various organs within the body, true internal organs. So absolutely, you could die of the fever, you could die of shock from the high fever, you can die from the shutdown of organs, but the idea of organs exploding in the body, you know, Hollywood craziness again. Okay, so simply taking the normal signs and symptoms that would be associated with Ebola and just turning up the volume a lot. But that's what you see. That is Ebola virus. Now, the other part of the story that's really interesting is the what if story. So think about the progression of the virus moving from this one isolated valley and village in Africa, the capture of a monkey, and suddenly the virus is on the shores of the greatest nation in the world, right? Anyone from America here, by the way? Oh, good. Although I'm being recorded, so maybe I need to keep my comments careful. Normally it's just within these sort of four walls, but now it's on tape. You get where I'm heading. But again, this is actually a true story. This is a real story. Ebola is not just one virus. That's like saying all humans are just like me, which is very scary, really. But there are a range of Ebola viruses that we're aware of. I mean, not a huge number, but there's several strains of Ebola virus. So the ones that come out of East Africa, the ones that have been causing the major public health problems, they're the ones that do have a 50 to 80% mortality. They killed hundreds, thousands of people, etc., etc., etc. But there is an Asian variety of Ebola. And it's actually been called Ebola reston. Very good reason for that. That a monkey was caught, was taken to an animal holding facility in Reston, Virginia, to the US. This monkey then got sick. And when they investigated what was making the monkey sick, it contained this virus, that one up there on the screen. And they all go, oh, this is Ebola. Holy hell, we've now got Ebola in the US. Luckily, as they started to investigate, they realised that this virus had no virulence, could not cause any significant disease in humans. It's still an Ebola virus. Okay? So the basis of outbreak, the main plot line of bad virus comes to the US and threatens our very existence, is based on Ebola as a virulent virus, and also the scenario of what happens if Ebola made it to the country, and it actually did. Just fortunately, the type of Ebola that made it to the US was not virulent, did not cause disease in humans. But those two things together, that's really the basis of the movie. Okay? True stories. Other question, I'm not sure whether I still have answered all of your question about different types of viruses. So that goes in part. While I'm on this, let me skip past all of this stuff. That's all basic biology, we can come back to that. So truth or fiction, just a few other things while we're on this topic. The characters. Again, the idea of who was involved in this, who are the protagonists, has a basis in truth. So Dustin Hoffman's character is based on this guy here called C.J. Peters, who is, affectionately known as the virus hunter. You may recall at one point Dustin Hoffman says to Morgan Freeman, send Peterson's team to New Mexico to look for what they call the Hunter virus. Now, Hunter virus is also a very nasty virus. They talk about trapping rats, I think, is in there as well. So hantavirus is a virus that is harboured by rodents, and you can actually contract it from the urine of the rodents. So if you're living in a poor hygienic environment, the rodents, end up peeing on your food, and you end up eating that food, you get hantavirus. And it's also another hemorrhagic fever type of virus. And this is what C.J. Peters has made a career of, is getting into some of these areas and discovering new viruses and understanding them. And hantavirus, H-A-N-T-A virus, hantavirus, is one of his claims to fame. So C.J. Peters is part of the character build for Dustin Hoffman's character. Okay, that's another photo of him with the beard, and I like this because, okay, you sort of think, he doesn't really look like Dustin Hoffman, I don't think. He looks more like the monkey. Now, McClintock, and I like this story because this is a very personal story. So for a number of years, I taught in the Northern Hemisphere summer at Kansas State University, and going back a few years, I got to meet this guy up on the board called Jerry Jacks. Now, Jerry is currently Vice Provost of Kansas State University, and he's there and he looks after safety in the broad sense. I'm not saying the broad sense. That the US used to have a major biological research facility, not the Fort Detrick one, but another one in New York, on one of the islands there. And they felt that this was too close to the border, too easy to attack, okay, not secure enough. They've actually moved that big biological research facility to Kansas State University, and Jerry heads up that facility. Now, I had the good fortune to meet Jerry, it's got to be more than 5 years ago now. But there he is when he was actually in the army. See the resemblance? What's more, both Jerry and his wife were actually in the army and based at Fort Detrick for some years. I mean, he's now obviously in the university sector, sort of still with government in effect, but no longer in the army. I asked him, he never admitted to whether there was any modelling of the character, but I sort of thought this is just too much of a coincidence to see him, hear his stories. And I'll just relate one, it's got nothing to do with viruses as such, but you're probably aware of a very nasty disease called anthrax. It's caused by a bacterium. He, during his time in the army, had the opportunity to travel to a range of countries, including the old USSR. And he related a story to a range of us one day over dinner that he walked into a lab, and just sitting in an old coffee can in a test tube on a windowsill were several strains of anthrax that they'd been working on, just really kind of open in the lab. Scary stuff, especially when we come back to what I said earlier about the fact that even though smallpox has been eradicated from the wild human population, shall we say, there are still 2 repositories in the world, one in the US and one in Russia. So when you sort of think about that story of, hang on, anthrax sitting on a windowsill, you do wonder just how well at least the Russians are guarding their stocks of smallpox, and you still might wonder about just how secure the smallpox stocks are in the US. And of course there has been quite a debate right up to the UN about whether we should fully destroy smallpox. And the belief is that given we have all the genetic information available today to, if we wanted to, reconstruct smallpox, then probably we should get rid of any physical remnants of smallpox left. We probably should destroy them. But I'll leave you to think about that a little bit in terms of, is it appropriate to deliberately make a species, even a species of virus, extinct? Okay? No, but to take that story a little bit further, and you mentioned Spanish flu. I might jump ahead to the flu because that's that facility. We can talk about all sorts of stuff. But let me find flu. Got it in here somewhere. Oh, that's what I wanted. Okay. I'm sure all of you have heard a lot about the flu virus. I mean, probably a number of us have had the flu, the true flu. A number of us will have said, I've had the flu. And I've probably had a cold. And for the boys in the crowd, it's probably man flu, right? I've had a cold, but it feels so bad that it's got to be the flu. Okay? A lot of people have actually not experienced influenza. No, often, and this is the thing, people get the runny nose and the cough and they sort of say, oh, I must have the flu. Okay? The flu tends to be an upper respiratory tract infection. So you do get some illness here, some discomfort. You do get fever. You might get a drier cough. But typically a cold is up here. A cold is in what we call the nasopharynx. Their virus is called rhinoviruses. They give you that runny nose. But the flu doesn't tend to do that. The flu tends to really hit your core pulmonary system, okay, in that upper respiratory tract. Now, thinking about different types of viruses, there are a whole range of flu viruses. And the influenza virus tends to attack the sorts of animals that we rely on for food, and particularly those that are reared intensively, so pigs and poultry in particular. A lot of the influenza viruses have their preferred host is something avian, something bird. Okay, and because chickens are what we have contact with, that's where the connection comes. Now, you will have heard of something like H5N1 or H1N1. Everyone's sort of heard about these viruses, bird flu or swine flu and things like that. Going way, way back, the Spanish flu, and of course they mentioned the Spanish flu killing 25 million people worldwide. Just while I'm on that, it never was the Spanish flu. It was called the Spanish flu because that's where they first started to recognise major infection in humans, and so it was coined as the Spanish flu because that's when people really started to stand up and take notice. But it's believed that it came from somewhere else. Now, to the H5N1 story. Basically, influenza virus is classified, or the different strains of flu virus are classified on the basis of two surface markers. If we think of the movie and the new strain of Ebola, they talk about spikes on the surface. Well, a flu virus has exactly that. It has spikes. Let's see if I have a picture of that. Yeah, I thought I had a better picture of that. Oh yeah. So look at those blue and red structures. That's a sort of a model of the virus. And basically the flu virus is like a lot of complex viruses that hit humans. They have inside, so look at that green curly stuff, they have inside their genetic blueprint. Now that can be made of DNA, just like the blueprint inside our cells, okay, which is probably really the most common form of genetic blueprint. Or in the case of viruses, it can be made from a related molecule called RNA. Okay, so a number of viruses have an RNA genome, if you like, or genetic blueprint. For some viruses then, they just have a very simple coat made of protein on the outside, and that's it. That's what the virus, a simple virus, is made of. Now, it may be simple in structure, but that also means it survives well in the environment. So something like polio virus survives really well. It can be spread through water, contaminated water, Why? Because that virus is resistant to the environment. So we could be, or someone here could be infected with poliovirus. We excrete it through our waste, through our feces. That goes into, say, waterways, the environment, and it finds its way into water or even onto food. And then we consume that virus. It survives well. Other viruses are much more complex. And the influenza virus is kind of sort of in between. The influenza virus has a protein coat, but it also has a fatty layer. We call it lipid is the technical term, but we call it fat. And that comes from the outside of the cells after the virus is reproduced in the cells. As the viruses burst forth, remember in the movie they talked about the Ebola virus growing in the cells and then millions coming out? That idea. And they pick up some stuff from the surface of the cells. That becomes part of the virus. And then on the very outside of a virus like the influenza virus, we have virus proteins, these blue and red bits. And they give different types of flu virus their identity. So back to that. There are two molecules called, for simplicity, H and N. Okay, so H5N1. The H is what's called a hemagglutinin. Doesn't really matter too much. What's important about that is its function. What that does, it allows the virus to attach to cell surfaces as the first stage of infection and reproduction. Okay? Now there are a whole range of these hemagglutinins, these H's. And depending on the type of H, the virus will attach more or less efficiently to the cell surface of cells in different animal species. So a particular type of H might infect pigs better. It might infect chickens better, or it might infect indeed humans better. Okay, but typically, again, the preferred host for the flu virus is not a human being. Right? So it's just a chance that we are one of the species that is sensitive or susceptible to infection with flu. The other molecule, the N, is probably less important in this regard because it's really about the other end of the infection process. This is something that helps the virus burst back out of the cell. It helps the virus to break down the wall of the cell once new virus has been made, to burst out and then start to look for and infect other cells. Okay? So the H is probably more important because that's the initiation of infection. That's attachment to cells. So when we talk about H5N1 or H3N2, we're simply recognising different types of those two surface proteins that we can recognise through actually using things like antibodies to differentiate different flus. In terms of our public health, that's important to recognise these different flu types because every year the World Health Organization and various collaborating labs around the world, including here in Australia, they talk to each other about what flu viruses are we seeing? What are we seeing coming out of China or out of Europe or out of the Americas or even out of Australia? And early, what sort of severity of disease are they causing? And then once they identify those viruses, they go into overdrive in terms of producing vaccines. So they say, we're going to make a vaccine that's based on these 3 or 4 really common or prevalent types of flu virus, put them together into a vaccine, and then spread that back to the world. And of course, the people who are considered to be most susceptible, most at risk, you know, the elderly in particular, that's when we see all the ads saying, get yourself to a doctor, get your flu jab. Right? Now that's not a perfect system. Some years they guess wrong. And that happened not so long ago. When the press, or the media, were going to town saying there's a really bad strain of H1N1 circulating, I think it was about 3 years ago now, they put that particular strain of H1N1 into the vaccine. It turned out here in Australia, we had an even worse strain of H1N1 circulating, but for some reason the vaccine was only partially protective Okay, so again, they didn't get it quite right. It's a bit of a guessing game. But basically, that's a very brief description of where the HN description of flu comes from, and the fact that there are different types of flu viruses and they will have different infectivity for different types of animals, including humans. All right? So I think that goes a little more towards answering your question about sort of vaccines and different types of organisms. The other thing that was interesting in particular about influenza virus is I mentioned that those two molecules, in particular the H, is important in getting onto a surface. Now there was a H1N1 virus that was very, very nasty. And it actually was quite poorly infective for humans, so in terms of attaching to cells. What was really interesting about it was able to reproduce really, really rapidly, more rapidly than the typical flu virus. Now that was important for two reasons. One, it meant that of course it could reproduce and produce more virus a lot more rapidly and spread in the body more rapidly. But also because of that very quick reproduction, our immune system became our own worst enemy. Now, our immune system is a wonderful thing generally in terms of preventing or challenging infection with foreign agents. You know, it keeps us safe for a lot of our life. And of course we get help through getting things like vaccination. But at times the immune system can really be terrible. You heard recently about the asthma deaths after the lightning storms in Victoria. Great example. Okay, what's happened there is people have had an overly strong reaction to those allergens that have challenged their body. Okay, it's a bit like people dying from peanut allergy, right? An extreme sensitivity to a very low level of a foreign entity, in that case a peanut protein. And the immune system basically overreacts, and that overreaction creates a shock in the body that is fatal in those who are most sensitive. Okay, and it can be the same with the viruses. And what caused the deaths among people who were infected with this particular flu virus was basically the same thing. There was so much virus within the lung tissues that we ended up with severe inflammation through what's called a cytokine storm. I just love that term. Okay, it doesn't really matter too much technically, but what it means is that part of the immune process, the immune system, created overwhelming inflammation and tissue death and shock that people died. And that's why the rapid multiplication of the virus was really important, even though the virus in itself was not particularly infective. Once it became infective and once it started to reproduce, that was when the virus became a problem. But not for the virus itself again, it was because of our immune system overreaction to the presence of so much virus. One more thing while I'm on the flu, because we talked about malaria and things like that, we heard mention of the Spanish flu. And talking about the science, we've mentioned smallpox, that we understand smallpox very well. We could get rid of smallpox, and if we wanted to, we could make it tomorrow. We haven't done that with smallpox, but we've done it with influenza. So we've gone back, not me, although I was actually working about 10 years ago in a lab where some of the people were part of this experiment. They were able to get a body out of permafrost soil in Scandinavia somewhere, as I recall, a body of a soldier that had died from the so-called Spanish flu. They were able to extract the genetic blueprint, the DNA, and put that together and reproduce the Spanish flu from its genes. So, flu Frankenstein? Absolutely. They've basically brought back the Spanish flu. Now again, think about that idea of science versus application. You might think, hang on, that's really clever. Wow, what an achievement. But what happens if someone gets their hands on that and decides to aerosolize it, weaponize it and spread it? Right? In 1918, 25 million or so people died around the world from that flu. If you decide to spread that deliberately, what could that do globally as a biological weapon? Right? Forget Ebola. Okay, the flu does spread nicely, airborne, aerosolized. There's a great weapon for you. And we might kill those 260 million Americans. Did I say that? Oh. Now, one question I'd like to put back to you is, what about the idea of bombing Cedar Creek? What do you think about that? Remember that conference at the White House boardroom? You know? Unethical? Yeah? 2,000, I thought they were very clever in their maths. Happened to have this Cedar Creek village town, 2,600 people, and of course at the time as they portrayed it, 260 million Americans. So Cedar Creek population is 0.001% of the US population. Nice and convenient. I don't know. I mean, let's just assume it would. We certainly saw what they did to the Mataba village with one of those petrol sort of air bombs.
It's more humane way to kill them, but sure. It's like a trolley problem, right? You can divert the trolley and kill one person, or
Right.
you can let it kill 5 people.
Yeah.
Is that just blown up in America?
Yeah, it's kind of wisdom of Solomon kind of thing, isn't it? Yeah. The idea of having to make a terrible choice, basically. You know, what's the wisdom versus the ethics? I mean, someone who's absolutely ethical would say, every human life is valuable, we've got to do our utmost to save every human life, right? But you saw the scenario. And let's face it, if we think about the world as it was, and the movie portrays that really, really well, right? They talk about the village. This virus kills very rapidly. What happened with the guy who came back and infected the village originally? He'd walked, right? Like we did hundreds of thousands of years ago, right? Humans were nomadic, small groups. We got around slowly, right? Today, I can be on the east coast of America from Sydney in 18 hours, right? I can hop the Qantas A380 out of Sydney and I land in Dallas, well, about 16 hours later. If you think, hang on, if I'm infected now, well, if I'm infected with the Mataba, I'm dead halfway, the way they portray it. But if I'm infected with Ebola, I'm probably just starting to get the first mild symptoms when I hit the USA. I've gone halfway around the world with that virus. And then I start coughing on people, or, you know, I kiss my wife when I arrive home or whatever, yeah? Like Jimbo and Alice, you know, maybe not quite that sort of kiss. I mean, you know, clearly she was going to get infected. I mean, she must have ended up with about half a litre of saliva, you know, based on the kiss they had there. But, you know, you get the idea that the problem is that we now have gone from that idea of the Mataba village in the jungle, where I walk into the jungle, I get infected from a monkey and I sort of walk back. I can't walk to Kinshasa in time. I'm going to die in the jungle before I could walk there. But in the modern village sense, we are that global village. Any of us can get from one part of the world to, again, the other side of the world in less than a day.
Does that then protect us from that carpet bombing kind of thing? It's useless?
From the?
From like carpet bombing, let's say, an entire country, even as useless, right? Because someone could have just traveled.
Well, that was the vision, wasn't it? If someone gets out and they have some contact that allows for the spread of some kind of fluid, and again, remember the virus has then gone airborne, based on the portrayal in the movie. We can come back to that issue itself. That's kind of another bit of Hollywood wonder. But in terms of spread, the fact that it's airborne means that I've just got to cough on someone, right? So I hop on a plane and there's, let's say the air circulates fully. An A380 carries about 500 people. So I've now infected 500 people. They get off that plane, actually let's not pick the US. I do a lot of trips to Dubai and hub out of Dubai, right? So I hit Dubai in 14 hours. I've coughed and coughed on my way over there. 500 people are now infected. Those 500 people are travelling to all parts of the world, right? Some will go on to London, some will go to Europe, some will go to parts of Africa. So suddenly, those 500 people are going to infect people heading to the 4 points of the globe. And the next thing you know, forget the little red dot spreading across just the USA. We've got that sort of mapping sort of progression happening globally. I mean, that's how scary it is.
It's a less related question, but how does that concept of there's one monkey who is clearly his body keeps producing this virus but is not affected by it, so he's the host.
Yep.
But there's another monkey who gets infected by it and that kills or is hurting the monkey. How does it work that the one monkey can keep producing the virus but have the antibodies that aren't?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it is one of the points I think where the movie loses continuity, because if you remember, Jimbo was trying to make sure that the monkey in Rudy's store, yeah, Rudy was the pet store owner, right? That he had basically, I think, I can't remember whether it was male and male, but right, Jimbo brought, say, another male monkey, and he already had a male monkey when he needed a female or whatever it was, yeah? Or they were either both boys or both girls, right? But they wanted a mating pair. They were the same species as far as I could tell from the way they portrayed the movie. And therefore it's strange to think that you would have one monkey that was carrying not one but two types of virus. That's another issue again. But that one monkey at the same species was acting as a host, and that the other monkey, same species, suddenly was a victim. Okay? It is possible, because even amongst us, we will vary in our susceptibility to infection with different agents. Right? So I might have been exposed in my past to a particular type of flu virus. Right? Now, I get attacked by another flu virus. Not the same one as I've had before, but maybe closely related. Now, my immune system provides enough cross-protection that I don't get infected, or don't get infected badly by that flu virus. Whereas you have never seen anything like that flu virus before, and this one's particularly nasty. You get it, and despite being a healthy young man, you die. Okay, so it can happen. It's not that far-fetched. And I think that's kind of, it's not explained obviously, but from my background knowledge and watching that in the movie, I suspect that's kind of where they were going, that one monkey happened to be immune or less susceptible, less sensitive, and the other monkey was sensitive.
So how do you have an organism that keeps producing the virus
Yep.
and has antibodies?
Yep.
Why doesn't those antibodies?
Well, remember good question. Remember that the antibodies are part of circulation in the bloodstream typically, although we do produce any of us, or particularly, should say modern animals. Birds are a little different, another story. But we do have secretory antibodies that we can release from mucous membranes, even say in the mouth or the nasopharynx, or down even in the gut. So we do have a certain amount of antibody, not just circulating the bloodstream, but other parts of the body that could attack an invading agent like a virus. But it's always a dynamic, typically. Now, it can be that certain viruses in certain hosts, or certain bacteria, any agent in a host, establishes enough of a relationship that that agent can remain active and present in the body. So we do have true hosts where an agent does establish a colonisation in the body and continues to multiply at low level. Not enough to cause disease. And it may be that they exist, say, in the gut, where they can maybe actually reproduce, or in some cases they establish a safe site in certain internal organs, like the liver and spleen, and they can survive there, and they're released at times of stress. Okay, so that's a possibility. So true hosts, there's that kind of relationship and dynamic going on. We also have other carriers that we refer to as vectors. Now in vectors, they act as a fairly passive vehicle of transmission. Mosquitoes are a really good example. Okay? So a mosquito, you could be infected, well, let's take a really current topic, Zika virus. Right? Everyone's heard about Zika virus? Yeah, it's been all over, right? Zika virus is transmitted by intimate contact, body to body, so it can be during sex, it can be certainly during pregnancy from mother to fetus, for example, but also by blood transmission. So certain mosquitoes can suck the blood, the virus will survive within that blood within the mosquito, and when the mosquito bites someone else, a small amount of that blood is then transferred to the person being bitten next, and the virus is then transmitted. So a number of viruses that are a problem for humans are transmitted via vectors. Mosquitoes being very common. It's a Trivial Pursuit question. You know, what's the deadliest animal on the planet? And of course we are talking animals, loosely speaking. And everyone thinks, hang on, you know, tigers, lions, you know, all those things that might bite me, sharks, who knows. Mosquitoes. Because mosquitoes in transmitting viruses are responsible for millions of deaths around the planet a year, because they are important vectors of transmission of a whole range of viruses. Zika, dengue, whole range of these hemorrhagic fever type viruses like Ebola. Oh, is that the time? Others? Maybe a couple more questions if you have them. These notes will go up. There's a whole bunch of slides here that talk about basic biology of virus and things like that, and I'll hand these over because I've included some stuff from on Zika this year. So I'll send them on to Scott and they'll go into Moodle for you. What I might do then is just jump to the end with a couple of sort of big, all sorts of viruses. These are some of the sort of web-based press clippings that show you that we keep finding new viruses or old viruses that we haven't really seen before. Stuff on Zika. But let me get towards the end. What I would like to get you to think about is one of the areas that was portrayed in the movie, and that was about the spread of this virus, right? That they talked about, in the modern day sense, the village and the road being built through to Kinshasa and the idea of retribution of the gods. Now, I don't go in for all that stuff, I'm not religious, but in terms of a range of the viruses that we've come to interact with in recent times, and I only mean really in the last 5 to 10 years, or even more recent than that, that we have delved into environments where suddenly we've been exposed to viruses that may have existed for thousands of years. And there are a whole range of viruses transmitted by various species of bats in Australia, in Asia, in Africa, that have only come to light in recent times because suddenly we've been encroaching on those environments for the first time. Okay? So we do have to think about what our responsibility is in this. We think about the virus being the villain in a sense, but you know, we take some responsibility by bringing ourselves in contact with these viruses, and then they start to spread in the human or other animal populations. So realise that's important because it's circular. We go in there, we invade, we get exposed, and suddenly we're the ones who are then the victims of the virus. So on that, you might recall these couple of quick clips from the movie where Rene Russo first turns up and Dustin Hoffman's already there and they're walking through the hospital and she says, "So many, so fast." And of course he then says, apparently they all got it at a movie theatre. Just imagine, let me go back to the beginning where I started this session, where I talked about my travels, and just imagine that I've turned up here today and I've been to one of those exotic countries and I've picked up that exotic virus and I've been talking, breathing, maybe coughing just a little, and you're all sitting here. I'll leave you with that thought. I hope I've given you a few interesting insights into viruses, and it's given you a little more appreciation of this movie in particular, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the course. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.